Good evening and welcome to our second virtual Cuckfield Bookfest virtual book club. My name's Jenny Chance. I'm going to be your host this evening, and I am joined by two Bookfest favourites, Helen Fry and Alan Judd, who you can see on screen with me. I'm delighted to be joined by them this evening. But first of all, they're going to introduce themselves in a minute. But first of all, a reminder that the Bookfest will be happening in just over 2 weeks. It's taking place from the 3rd to the 5th of October in the beautiful village of Cuckfield in Sussex. So we have availability for some of our sessions. My colleague Carol's going to put a link to the Bookfest website in the chat. So please, if you haven't had time to book your tickets yet, have a look at our excellent programme. Alan is actually going to be chairing one of the sessions, so you can see him in person. So please have a look at that, not now, but after the session, and book your tickets. We do have availability. But time is short because we have two excellent speakers tonight. So we're going to get on with letting them introduce themselves. I'll be asking them questions that we've agreed for about 50 minutes. And then we've got my colleague Shona will be asking questions for about 10 minutes at the end. We've put everybody on mute just so that nobody gets disturbed during the session. So please type your questions into the chat. Shona will be taking them about 10 to the hour. So without further ado, Helen, please can I ask you to introduce yourself to everybody?
Oh, it's wonderful to be part of the festival and online. I do encourage people to book tickets for the live events. So I'm Dr. Helen Fry, historian. I've written widely in recent years on espionage intelligence, books such as The Walls Have Ears, MI9 Escape and Evasion, more recently Women in Intelligence. And my most recent book, which is due any day on the shelves, is behind me, The White Lady, about intelligence networks in Belgium in 2 world wars.
And so Carol was going to put the link to The White Lady into the chat, if she hasn't already. You can pre-order it from Waterstones, which is the festival's preferred partner. Alan, please introduce yourself to everybody here.
Well, I'm Alan Judd. I'm a novelist mainly. I've written a couple of biographies on the way, one about Ford Madox Ford and the other about a even less well-known character called Mansfield Cumming, who was the first chief and founding chief of MI6. About half my novels, because novels are what I normally do, about half my novels are spy novels and the others are all sorts of other things, some of them with historical settings.
Fantastic. And I absolutely loved your latest, which you don't have in the background, but number 2, Whitehall
Court. No, I haven't thought of that, but then there isn't a shelf there, is there?
No.
To hold it up or something. So,
no. Helen's nicely positioned hers behind her, but you need
right.
one. And it's got a red cover, and you've got a red jumper on. That would have been a nice...
Yes, I know, that would go very well.
Yes, but I can highly recommend that one because I absolutely loved it, and I loved Emily Gray.
So, thank you.
We've got questions grouped into a few different topics. The first of all being around where you both get your ideas and inspiration. I mean, between you, you've written over 40 books, which to me is incredible. And Alan, you've been writing for many years now. So first question to both of you, where do you find fresh ideas and inspiration for your books? Alan, do you want to take that first?
Okay, well, I think it emerges as a kind of idea and a feeling at the same time of something you're interested in. But some things are very obvious. My very first novel, which was quite an autobiographical one about being in the army in Belfast during the Troubles, it was such an obvious subject, the most intense thing that had happened to me at that stage, that I didn't even have to think about it, just thought about how to do it. Occasionally, too, something sparks you and you think immediately, oh, yes, that would be good. Although it's not normally that kind of process. But one of my books is called The Kaiser's Last Kiss, and it's about the death of the Kaiser. And that came about because I was walking along Piccadilly with a friend and talking of going to Holland with my wife. And he said, you must go and see the Kaiser's house. And he told me about the Kaiser's house with all his things in. And I said, but surely he was dead. He died, didn't he die just after the First World War? And he said, no, he died in 1941. So I thought, well, he died under Nazi occupation. So what was that like? So that's how that book came about.
Wow. And a bit later on, we have some questions about research, because researching that must have been interesting. And how did you get the idea for your latest novel?
Well, I'd done a series of spy novels set more or less now with a male hero. In fact, the hero of my first novel, and because I did all the research into intelligence and MI6, particularly during the First World War, when I did the Cumming biography, and I'd never really used it for anything else. And I just thought, well, why not go back to that period? I mean, espionage in the First World War, as I'm sure Helen would agree, is largely, it's not very well known about. There are a lot of books about the Second World War, but which overlay it, but there was just as much of it, and there was a kind of GCHQ equivalent. There were all sorts of things going on that we've forgotten about. So I thought, all right, give it a try.
Fantastic. And Helen, tell us about how you get your ideas and inspiration.
Yeah, and I love Alan's latest book, by the way, which touches and overlaps with part of mine. Yeah, I started sort of 25, 30 years ago looking at the 10,000 Germans, mainly Jews, who fought for Britain. And by around the middle of the war, having been digging for victory and being thoroughly frustrated at being in the Pioneer Corps, they were taken up for intelligence work, behind the lines, special operations, SAS. And one day, one of them said to me, I was stuck in the Buckinghamshire countryside with headphones on in the war. I wanted to fight on the front line. I was a secret listener. Did we do anything that made any difference to the war? And that was one of the largest, as we now found, intelligence operations of wartime alongside Bletchley Park that delivered war-winning intelligence. And I wrote that as part of The Walls Have Ears. And while I was doing that, I suppose across my 30-year career, I mean, I'm not filling in all of it, but as part of that, I unexpectedly started to uncover stories of the women, because I never expected to write about the women. And suddenly they're emerging across two world wars in roles that totally transcend what we ordinarily think of them as doing. And the so-called secretaries that were not doing secretarial work. Very, very interesting. So that led to my book more recently, The Women in Intelligence. And as part of that, there were women behind the lines in Belgium. Very little written about Belgium in both world wars, doing the most incredible intelligence gathering. And it was part of a network, La Dame Blanche, the White Lady in World War I, and Clarence Service, successor in World War II. And no one had written anything in recent times about this, and files have now become available, and I guess we can talk about the research a bit later, such that the timing was right. I wanted to write this book about a decade ago, and it wasn't possible. So that's sort of how I've got to where I am. And I just become inspired along the route and unexpected discoveries. And I think, oh gosh, that's got to be a book. And I never thought I would write about a woman again. And in fact, my next book after this one is a woman. So wow, never say never.
You're already prepared to write your next one, even though that one is still in pre-order. That's incredible.
But then I think Alan's the same, isn't it? It's kind of you start, because there's at least a 9-month delay between delivering the manuscript, then you've got your copy edits, but you've got to do something. And quite often I've gathered the research beforehand, so you know where the research is. So if I was to start something completely new, I don't know, by a more recent director of GCHQ, it would take me years. But I'm building on what I've already done, and therefore it might look impressive, but well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But it's building and knowing that the archives are where they are and using them.
So tell us, both of you, I mean, Alan, you mentioned an interesting story about the Kaiser there, but so Helen, just tell me, what's the most surprising or intriguing discovery you've made during your research for any of your books? Like a fun fact that you'd like everybody to take away.
Yeah.
Sorry, Helen, go first.
Yeah, shall I? Oh, do you know, that's a really difficult one because there've been moments, spine-tingling moments, and you think, no way. I think one of the biggest surprise. Am I allowed two?
Of course, yeah.
I mean, Alan, you can have three, maybe. top one on me. Yeah, I was doing some research for MI9, the Escape and Evasion branch of military intelligence that saved over 35,000 of our Allied personnel. And I discovered that it was also a massive intelligence gathering operation from guys that made it back from behind the lines. But they had a secret section called Room 900. And there's very little written about Room 900. And they were sending agents behind enemy lines, not like the Special Operations Executive, not like SOE, but on intelligence missions that are still, well, they haven't been declassified. But towards the end of my research, my publisher said, well, look, what's the relationship between MI6 and MI9? And I said, well, apart from MI9 being MI6 upside down, or the other way around, they said, but no, you've got to kind of, can you get under the skin of this? And I looked again, and it wasn't there in the early days. There was a file on Room 900 of 1942, and it turns out that this secret section of MI9 was involved in counter-espionage, tracking German spies in World War II, dead letter boxes, all that kind of thing. And the person who was signing it was Kim Philby. And I nearly screamed in the it's like very quiet in the reading room, and I thought, never in a million years would I have ever thought that Kim Philby, who of course turned traitor, well, something he's not a traitor, he's a double agent, would have been part of that operation. And then the other one, which is much briefer, is for this book behind me. It's said in the official history, it's in Alan's book on Mansfield Cumming, that in the official files, over 70% of all intelligence we got from behind enemy lines, from behind the German lines in World War I, came solely from this network.
Wow.
Now, some academics are challenging that, as they have a right to do, but that is extraordinary, and we've probably never heard of it. So that's an inspirational reason for telling that story.
Oh, love that. Alan, tell us your surprising, intriguing discoveries, and you can have more than one.
Well, just picking up on what Helen was saying about the 70%, if you want an argument against the challengers, I think it was 70% of intelligence received at GHQ, General Headquarters, in France, and in the last year of the war. So there are caveats. So you can employ those, if you need to. I have nothing so as exciting as the Kim Philby bit to relate. I mean, when I did the Cumming biography, it was based on his diaries, which have never been released and still are not released. So I was able to quote uninhibitedly from them. So in a way, everything in those was new to me anyway. And as for, surprises, I remember doing the Ford Madox Ford biography. It was published, it got nicely reviewed, and I got a letter from an American, a young man living in upstate New York, saying he'd read the review in The Economist of my book, and no doubt I knew all about it, but of course Ford had been engaged to his grandmother.
Oh.
And, he was very happy for me to see all the letters he'd got. And I'd never heard of this woman.
Wow.
I thought, what? When? How? Have I missed out a decade or something? What have I done? But it turned out there was a kind of secret engagement, which lasted some months, at a period in Ford's life when I was completely unaware there was any other gap. But that's the thing. It's the unknown unknowns where you don't think there's anything missing. You think you've got a complete account, and you haven't. So I was able to add a summary of those to the paperback. And the other thing I think was, this wasn't for me, but I think one of the most wonderful examples of this kind of thing must have been for an American academic called Leslie Hodson, who in 1925 discovered the coroner's report on the death of Christopher Marlowe, which had eluded everyone since Marlowe died in 1693. Wow. And it was simply because Hodson had the thought, well, Deptford, where Marlowe was killed, and I wrote a novel on Marlowe, which is why I was interested. Deptford. In 1593, Deptford, Kent, surely, not Deptford, London. And there it was in Kent County Archives, but no one had ever looked. And I thought, what a wonderful moment that must have been.
Wow. Yeah. That leads me nicely onto our next question, which relates to how do you verify the accuracy of the information that you're including in your books? Because obviously you're writing about historical events. So, Alan, for example, in your latest novel, you blend creativity or imagination about Emily and what might have happened. How do you, because I imagine both of you must receive reader letters challenging authenticity or accuracy of details. How do you blend those two, particularly if you're writing something that's fictional?
Well, I think you try to be very clear in your own mind to start with about where you're inventing and where you're not. And I'd like to make it clear that some things happened and some things didn't, and I usually put a prologue in or something like that, saying this is based on reality. But the main thing is, I think, to try to give it the truth of experience. It's something that could have happened. And say with Emily Gray in MI6 in that book, a lot of the stuff I quote about MI6 did happen, but Emily's part in it didn't exist because she's invented. So although she mixes with people who were historical figures, I'm making up the conversations, but some of their conversations were what were written down afterwards.
Okay.
It's a bit of a mixture, and I think you just have to be clear in your own mind and use it. After all, a novel is a novel. Biography is a biography.
And presumably, has that evolved for you over time? I mean, writing a biography must be very different from writing a fictional novel.
Except that, and I'd be interested to know what Helen thinks about this, imagining the past, and even if you're writing biography, your imagination is engaged. You must think, well, what Helen must think with one of her female spies, what would she have felt at that moment, or what would she have thought when that happened? You're using your sympathetic imagination. And I think imagining the past is very, very close, disturbingly close to remembering it too in your own life.
Yeah.
I'm not sure there's that much difference between imagination and memory.
Yeah.
Helen, I find it really important to visit places because we might assume it's no good just sort of looking on Google Images. And I was lucky enough a few years ago to be taken around the sites of Belgium, the aristocratic castles, which is just amazing that some of the scenes in the book, and you get a sense of distance, of space, of when they're cycling between with their secret messages between locations, you stand there and you feel that sense of place. And there was one time actually when I went in, I haven't written about it, but I went into an East End cemetery, and it's somebody who's supposed to have committed a very famous murder. I won't say who it is. And on there, someone's actually woven a little kind of tapestry and framed it about A5 size. It says, "I know you're innocent." And I thought, oh, wow. So visiting a place, I think, is terribly important. You just get the feel of what it's like to be there. But unlike Alan, I'm not allowed to create anything. All mine's got to be factual, otherwise I really get pulled up. And the deeper we go into history that's relatively unknown. So France, for example, for the last 30 years, we've got masses of research scholars and historians have done on the Second World War, on agents behind the lines. Belgium is still relatively new. And also with some of the women. So I'll give you one example where I was frequently challenged. I interviewed a 101-year-old veteran, and Alan may remember this story from when we chatted. I'm not sure if I did tell it a couple of years ago, but I interviewed her. She was in naval intelligence, part of the eavesdropping program, and she said we had a really unusual role as women. She said we were the interrogators. It's like, no. And she was right. She said we were the first and only known female interrogators used in uniform. And it was from 1941. Well, I found some interrogators later, some female interrogators, but the number of people that gave me grief over that. And I thought, no, she hasn't lied. So in my spare time, I went through the Naval Intelligence file, great big thick volumes, as Alan probably knows if you've got, they could be, 1,000 pages going through. And eventually, it took me a long time, just when I had some spare time in the National Archives. And eventually, I found this cluster of women who are in this photograph, including Evelyn Baron, and next to their names, individually, it said interrogator. So I do get frustrated. And the knitting one is another one that comes in here. Knitting codes into jumpers and scarves. I had a lot of grief over that and challenges until finally I found the reference in an intelligence officer of World War One in his memoirs in the Imperial War Museum, and it's quoted by Professor Christopher Andrew, but he uses a different source. So I'm thinking, please stop challenging. But it's tricky, and it can be, quite tricky. But you don't get let off the hook if people think you've made it up.
Yeah, particularly in your line of work, I get that. I'd be very interested in knowing about this East End cemetery. I like looking around the cemetery. So
I'm not giving up any secrets.
Well, that does take me on to our next set of questions, which are about research, which are both fundamentally important in both of your writing. First question is, obviously, what you're writing about, and you've alluded to it a number of times, both of you, is the secretive nature of intelligence, secret services. How do you access information that's often classified or hard to find? I mean, Alan, that was really interesting, that story of somebody writing to you and giving you letters that nobody had ever seen before, but I'm not sure that happens that often, I guess. Alan, how do you go about getting that kind of information to bring it into your
mind? I think as Helen was talking about the going into the archives and doing research in the file, and that is the sort of basic nitty-gritty of a lot of this kind of research. And the National Archives have a great deal of stuff in them that people don't know is there. And very often, I mean, a lot of, say, SIS, that is MI6 stuff, which is not supposed to be released to the National Archive, in fact, got released because people will be sent reports, and instead of sending them back as they were supposed to, they marked them up to the minister or something like that. The minister read them and marked it to someone else, and in the end, they forgot to send it back, and it goes into the National Archive in a different file. So it's not in an SIS or MI6 file, it's in the Foreign Office or Ministry of Defence file. And you find a lot of stuff there, as I'm sure Helen well knows. But I think going back very briefly to what Helen was saying about interrogators, and I do remember you talking about that lady. There was a woman who joined MI, and probably Helen knows about this, who joined MI5 in 1915 called Jane Sismore. And Jane, I'd like to know much more about her, and perhaps you do, Helen, but she was very bright and she got promoted. And I believe in the 1920s, she qualified as a barrister in her spare time, and I think might have come top of the bar exams. Then, with the outbreak of war in 1939, she fell out with MI5, or particularly with Vernon Kell, who was the DG in quite a big way, over an issue in which I think she was right, actually. And she transferred to MI6, and she married and became Jane Archer. And I believe she was to be posted to Philby's section, and Philby moved heaven and earth to try and stop her being posted successfully. And I think he says in his memoirs somewhere, but I'm not sure about this, Helen might know, that he's very glad that Jane Sismore never worked with him, and he wouldn't have wanted to be interrogated by her. So obviously the idea of female interrogators was not novel to people.
Yeah, and she actually interrogated the first Soviet defector, Walter Kravitsky, in 1940. Yeah. Right. And it's great because, she was the right person for the job, and she was assigned to do that when ordinarily it was very rare in that world. So gems like that are fascinating, aren't they? But when you come across them, and I think that constant surprise, I find, and Alan's, I guess you may find the same, we cease to be amazed by what we uncover. Just when you think, it can't get any better,
Yes.
it does. And there's so much still to discover.
Yes. Well, I thought with Jane Sismond's example, Emily Gray, the heroine in my latest novel, she could have a career like that. I mean, she could be working up into the Cold War,
Yes.
the 20s and 30s, and the Second World War. By the way, this is a bit of a sidetrack, but have you any idea what became of Jane after the war?
No, I don't actually. It's one of those things that I'm sort of starting to research what happened to the women, because everybody makes an assumption that they're demobilized. Well, if they're in uniform, maybe they are. But some of them, well, like Joan Clark, of course, who was at Bletchley Park, who didn't marry Alan Turing, he was the fiance. She goes on to have a distinguished career in GCHQ. So I wonder about Jane Sismore as well, because she's an expert, isn't she,
Yes.
on all things to do with communism, on Soviet Russia, alongside Millicent Baggott. And what is interesting, the official MI5 history says that there were no female intelligence officers in 1945 at the end of the war. And I'm not quite sure about that. And that's in the official history. So I think there's still a lot of questions going forwards.
It may be literally true in the sense that the grades they class as intelligence officers had no women, but there may have been women who were probably slightly lower or differently classed grade. So it may be a bureaucratic thing that.
And Helen, you referred to interviewing a lady who was 101. How much opportunity do you both have to interview people who were actually involved in some of the work that you're writing about or the stories that you're writing about? Is that, I mean, increasingly less people around, but presumably over the course of your careers, you've had opportunity to meet people who are involved.
Shall I take that, Alan, first?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, briefly to say, well, really, I mean, the Second World War, we're losing those eyewitness accounts.
Yes.
Early Cold War as well, actually. So I think we've been so busy focused in the last 20 years or so, and quite rightly, on getting the Second World War, that we're now realising there are very few. For example, in the early part of the intelligence corps, the first 100 officers, there are now only, last count, only 4 left of the first 100 officers officially, when the intelligence corps was officially allowed to go forward in peacetime in the 1950s. So, yeah, we're losing that as well. And I have been lucky. I was able to interview some of the surviving secret listeners who were eavesdropping in the wartime. Fritz Lustig, who said to me, "Did we do anything that made any difference to the outcome of the war?" And that's when I went on that journey to tell the story, but we didn't expect to uncover exactly how significant it was. So I miss them, actually. They give you something that you can't just get from the files.
No, I get that.
And I interviewed, just finally to say, I interviewed a lady who was approaching 100 in Belgium for the MI9, and she was involved in the escape lines. So between the age of 16 and 18, for 2 years, she escorted our guys out of the forest along part of the escape line. She was eventually arrested with all of her family in November 42. She did survive, her father didn't. But she and her mother survived 3 years in concentration camps. And I said to her, "Why did you do it, Elsie?" And her face changed. It was so defiant, and I was no longer in the room. And she said, the fight, in essence, she said quite a bit, in quite a lot of anger and defiance, this soft, kind lady. She said, the fight for freedom transcended everything. It's only when you've lost freedom you realise it's the most precious thing. And it was like, that for me was transformational in understanding what I just plodded through in archives at this end in London. So they do give you something really very, very special.
And was her memory quite clear? Because I mean,
Yes.
it's a long time ago now. Yeah.
Yeah, very, very vivid. She just looked over my shoulder in the nursing home. I was in her room, and I was no longer there. And then she sort of came back. And I've never had an interview like it before or since. Mm-hmm. That soft, kind, gentle lady, she had the same defiance as a photograph I've used in the book of her at 18. You know, no one's going to get one over on her. The utter defiance in her posture and her face, I still encountered it 80 years later. Wow. It was extraordinary. And I think we're going to miss that in history, in our telling of history.
Yes. And slightly tangential, where's your favourite place that you've been? You talk about going to places to research your novels. Where would you say is your favourite place that you've been?
Oh, this is for Alan. This is you. You're the novelist.
I'll come to Alan in a minute. I just want to know, because you
Oh,
talked about being to Belgium and the.
oh yeah. That's a difficult one, actually. Yeah, I think perhaps Belgium. It's got to be Belgium.
Oh, love that.
Yeah, that was just very, very special, actually. Just in a very relaxed way, being driven round to the sites where all of this secret stuff happened, and nobody realising that so many of those discreet castles, because they are just hidden in the countryside, across quite large distances, 50 to 100 miles, they're all sort of connected in some way, and were hiding our guys, hiding Jews, also involved intelligence work in sectors. And it is inspirational to actually go and see those sites. And there's a site in Brussels I'll talk about with my next book, actually, when that comes out more publicly. I don't want to talk about it now, but that for me was an exciting moment to see where this particular woman operated, because I didn't think the address still survived.
Brilliant. And Alan, same question to you then. Who have you met and where have you been?
I do agree about visiting places. I think it's such an important thing, and it gives you that feel. But there are hazards, and much more prosaically than with Helen. I set a fairly short scene in a novel in Hartlepool, where there is a small nuclear power station, which I wanted to use in the novel, you see. So I went there.
Yeah.
And people were coming out from work, ending their shift and that sort of thing. And I lingered outside the gates and I took a few photos so I could get the description more or less right. And I got arrested.
Oh.
by,
For what?
Well, by the Ministry of Defence Police. They thought I was, a possible dangerous person trying to get into the nuclear station and do bad things about it. But I mean, they're very nice. The misunderstanding was sorted out eventually after they'd searched my car and checked with the hotel and checked with my family and checked with the publishers that I was. Well, the trouble was, you see, I wasn't who I said I was. I mean, when they asked me who I was, I said, well, I gave my real name, which is Alan Petty. And what are you doing here? And I said, well, I write books as Alan Judd. So you're not Alan Petty then? No, I am Alan Petty, but, you can see how the thing can escalate.
Yeah.
But I think generally visiting the places you're right about is always a good thing, and it's good fun, and it's interesting.
So obviously your first novel was Northern Ireland. You said semi-autobiographical. Where else have you been?
Well, South Africa. I set a novel in South Africa. The Kaiser one it takes place all in Holland at House Doorn, where he lived, and which is worth visiting, by the way. You see all his stuff there, and what an eccentric figure he was. Comes over. Well, other places I generally get to if I can, but during COVID it was a bit difficult. I remember with one novel in particular. So I was having someone travel back from somewhere in the home counties to another place, and sort of using Google Earth and Google Maps a lot to give a reasonable sort of description. Whereas ideally, I'd like to have gone and walked it myself.
Yes.
But no one has yet got in touch and said you got that wrong. But in my experience, by the way, is going back to this thing on facts and people coming back to you, is the most dangerous thing in factual corrections in novels and probably history too, is guns. The world is full of gun buffs. And if you mention a gun and it's not quite the right gun, or it doesn't fire in quite the way that you said, you get letters from everywhere, muzzle velocities and all that sort of thing. So it's much easier just to say he pulled out a gun. One can criticize.
I imagine that's quite difficult for a copy editor to even know. I mean, you'd have to have very specialist knowledge, right, of guns. Yeah.
Most people don't, but there are buffs that do. Same with trains.
Okay. And cars?
Yes, cars are easier to get right in a way, but or at least I find it, because I write about cars. I'm a motor journalist as well, so I like cars. So I'm generally, if I say something about a car, I'm interested. But I did get trains dramatically wrong once. I had someone go through Slough on his way to Beaconsfield. Now, the train from Marylebone to Beaconsfield doesn't go through Slough. I knew that. I've done it dozens of times. Why did I put Slough? I don't know. I've no idea how that got in. But of course, the person who wrote in first of all said, if you can't even get that right, I can't trust anything else in your book. Quite.
Harsh. We're going to move a bit onto the writing process. We'll have plenty of people listening in who are interested in your lives as writers. Moving from research to the actual writing process, how much time does it take you to write a book? And so what percentage of time would be in the research? Do you do the research and then write, or do you do research, write? How do you manage the process of writing each of your books? Alan, do you want to take that first?
Okay, well, it varies with the book. As a general rule, I have a writing routine, and I think most writers do of some sort, either so many hours a day or so many words. I like to write in the mornings and do something outside in the afternoons, and then sometimes return to it very briefly early evening. When I was writing full time, because about half my books were written whilst I was working full time in the Foreign Office, I would have a rule where I had to write on a minimum of 4 days out of 7. And I had a minimum amount to do each day. And that amount was so low that I had no excuse for not meeting it. So generally, I did slightly more than my minimum. But as for how long a book takes, very often for me, it would be 6 or 7 months for a first draft, and then as long again to rewrite it, because I then rewrite.
Wow.
And so that was about it. But there was one novel, well, a novella, which took a month. And that was the month of February. I don't like February, middle months usually. And I thought I have to have a tactic for getting through February. And that was a novel that didn't require any research because I'd been to the places I was writing about. And it's probably the most literary novel I've written. And it just came out like water from tap. It just hardly altered from the first draft to published version.
That was your most productive February ever.
Yes, it was. Yes, probably the only productive February too.
And when you were working, you mentioned when you were part-time working, or you were working at the Foreign Office, and you had a minimum word count. Did you come home from work and then write, or?
Yes, I'd write in the evenings and weekends and during leaves.
Wow, so that must have been hard.
Well, lots of writers do. Lots of writers. I mean, Helen probably has academic duties that you have to squeeze your research and your writing in around them. I mean, very few writers write full time and have no other source of income because they can't afford it. There's not enough books sell enough.
Yeah. Helen, tell us how you manage it.
Yeah, that's true. And can I just say very briefly, I had the honour of interviewing the late Freddie Forsyth, and he used to write his novels from start to finish on his old typewriter in a month with no edits. Now, I think that's just extraordinary. That's not me. Endlessly editing. And I think that's the thing. You scope the research, start on the research, and then at some point I think, I've got to start getting this into chapters. So the chapters are known pretty much in advance, although you might add one or two if you find extra research that you think actually this needs to be in there. And so for me it's a process ongoing. I'll be writing mornings like Alan are best for me, although I don't exclusively keep to mornings, and I don't set myself a word count. So sometimes at the end of a morning, because I've done a lot of thinking through stuff, I've only written a paragraph. I think, no, this isn't good enough. But generally, I just do what I do within about a couple of hours, usually in a cafe. And then I do something a little bit different in the afternoon, or I might go to a different cafe and do a little bit more. But I do mix it up because I think the brain works better if you mix it between talks. And as Alan said, you do have to have some supplementary income. And I'm lucky my husband supports me as well. Otherwise, it would be difficult. But I am pretty much free as a self-employed historian. But that I do have to to do other things to help put bread and butter on the table. So yeah, I do that, and then I'll edit, but I don't endlessly do it. But I'll then give it a break and then go back to that chapter, and you can see where it needs shaping. What I think is important is not to think you have to write the perfect version first time round, which subconsciously a lot of people think they do. I mean, Freddie, bless him, the late Freddie Forsyth was able to do it, but most of us can't. And I think just subconsciously we tend to think we have to get a perfect version down. And if that's the case, I believe most of us will never finish a book. So I don't worry about that. And then sometimes the editor will sort of turn it around slightly because they think it's slightly better in a certain way. So no amount of editing I could have ever, foretold what an editor then might do with just tweaking it and that. So there comes a point where you have to just let it go. And that's okay.
Do you do all of your research first and then amass into chapters? Or
No, I don't normally. So I might have a bulk of research, enough to get me started. And it's during the writing process I realise there might be gaps. And in intelligence history, there are always gaps. So that's another thing you learn on the journey, that it can't be a complete history. You think you're going to write the whole complete history, which is, again, a myth I grew up with in the 70s and 80s, that the history you deliver, the history books you read, are the definitive. And there isn't much more to learn. Of course, we've shifted and changed since then. So, yeah, there are always going to be gaps. But sometimes I think, actually, where could I find some more about this? And sometimes, the gaps just remain, and that's okay.
And do you plan your books in advance? So do you have like a structure and then write to the structure?
Yes, you have to do that for the publisher. So I write I've got a very close working relationship with Yale University Press. Now, I mean, I used others in the early days before we were linked up, before we met, and they're absolutely fabulous. A big shout out to them. They are so supportive, dedicated, hard-working team. They really are phenomenal. I hope other publishers close their ears at this point, but I don't want to work with anyone else because they're just so amazing. And it's all part of that sort of teamwork, but they need a structure to take to their acquisition board, so that the commissioning editor would have to take it to the board, and the board will say, yeah, okay, we'll take this, and well, what about a chapter on that? Can she do anything on that as well, and slip that in? So you do have to have a structure, but sometimes there are, as I say, extra chapters. So like in the women's book, it was only during the research I accidentally uncovered about an English woman who married a Hungarian count. So she became Countess Miska, and she ended up being, as far as we know, in declassified files, the first and only spy swap of the Second World War, from what we've discovered so far. And I thought, no, that's got to go in. But I hadn't discovered it at the time of the proposal. But the board is not going to look back and say, well, I'm terribly sorry, it wasn't in the original proposal, please take it out. There's a natural progression, and you know what to leave in and what to leave out, really, what's going into too much detail. And I suppose the other thing to say is that if I find the research interesting, I hope that my readers will be the same. So that's almost a subconscious criteria, actually. If I find I'm getting bogged down in some of the technological stuff that I don't understand, Enigma's one of them, and the cryptographic stuff, then I think, oh my gosh, I can't do this. I'm not the right person to write this.
Yeah, I get that. And Alan, presumably there's a difference for you when you are writing fiction.
Well,
how do you plan your novels? Or your books?
They do, but just going back to what Helen was saying, it's so unusual and so nice to hear a publisher full of fulsome praise for a writer full of fulsome praise for her publisher. Usually it's quite the opposite. But I knew Freddie Forsyth as well, and I think Freddie, I agree with what you said. That's how he worked. He would do about a year's research before he sat down for his month of writing, and he talked to no end of people and make no end of notes. But I do wonder if his ability to get it right first time when he did it went back to his journalistic training, where, you had to get your copy in by 6 o'clock tonight, and that was it. You didn't have time to go back over it, and he was just good at that, I suspect. But anyway, yes, I've now forgotten the question you asked me.
Do you plan your novels in advance? Do you write them spontaneously?
Yes.
How do you go about
Yes,
it?
I generally have a very rough plan, which is probably 10 points on a piece of A4 paper, handwritten. And I know where I'm going to start, and I think I know the route to get to the end. And I know what I want the end to be, usually, unlike some other novelists. But when I'm writing it, the route actually varies, and I will then be adding bits between these points on the way through, and sometimes making detailed notes for the next bit. Generally speaking, it's roughed out beforehand, and the novels follow roughly the paths I've taken with variations.
I can see lots of questions coming into the chat. So I'm going to ask you one final question to each of you before I pass to Shona. What piece of advice, and I'm going to limit you to one piece of advice for this one, do you have for anybody who might be listening who is either writing historical novels at the moment or historical work? What one piece of advice would you have for them? And I mean, Helen, you can't say go to Yale University Press. Helen, let's start with you. What's your one piece of advice to any budding historical writers out there?
I think it's to start writing. Not to worry whether it's perfect or not. And again, I think that's a subconscious hang-up sometimes. Well, hang-up's probably a bit of a strong word. But when I talk, to people that want to write, whatever it is, they kind of think, well, I can't possibly do it because I can't get it right. I wouldn't be able to get it right. But you don't have to get it right first time. Just make a start and enjoy it. Really enjoy it. And don't worry. Blank out the noise. Don't worry what other people think. Just get it down. You can always edit it. So get started.
And that actually would stand for any kind of writer, I guess, not just historical fiction. Alan, what would you say?
Well, I think I'd echo Helen here, and Helen is actually perhaps unconsciously echoing the late, great Raymond Chandler, the American writer, who said, don't get it right, get it written. And I think there's a great thing in that. And just plod on, and don't keep thinking about the end. Just put one foot in front of the other until you've got there. But also, if you're wondering what to write about what really interests you.
Okay. That's always my problem. It's like, what am I interested enough to write 100,000 words about?
Well, write 50,000 instead then.
That still seems like a lot of words, right? 50,000. I mean, between
it's more manageable. And just think of that. Don't think of the 100 or how far it is. It's like if you set out to run a marathon, don't think about 26 miles, 385 yards. Think about the next 100 yards.
Just sit down and crack on, is what you're saying. Your message to everybody out there is just get on with it, right?
Yeah.
Well, you two have clearly been very successful in just getting on with it. I am in awe of the number of books that you have both published. So I am going to pass to my colleague Shona now. So I will disappear and Shona will appear. Paul, our colleague, is going to put that on screen, and then let's see what everybody listening has got to ask you. Is Shona now?
Hi, thank you very much, Jenny. So there are a couple of questions in the chat and a few more that I've received separately. Just Helen, building on what you were saying about how you choose to include, which episodes from your research you choose to include, are there scenarios where you've really wanted to put something into one of your books but not been able to for whatever reason, be that word count or other potential restrictions?
Yeah, there's actually, perhaps it's easier to say going forwards, because I think I've been pretty lucky in what I've already published, because I use declassified material. None of us can publish classified material. It's not permitted, and also it's irresponsible, actually, I think, as a historian personally, because we don't know why it's classified, you know, and we have to respect that. So if we accidentally uncover that, you kind of sort of know. But I do have a woman I'd like to write about in the Cold War, and there is some material. There's very little paper trail, but there is something. She did some incredible stuff, and we don't know if I'm allowed to tell it. So we're trying to work out if I'm allowed to tell that story. It would be wonderful if we could, but we're not sure.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And you mentioned earlier that the new book, you came, if I've got this correctly, that you wanted to write, you've been wanting to write about it for a long time, but you've only, a decade ago it wouldn't have been possible, but now it is. Is that because of the classification system, or is that new research has come to light? And how do you keep tabs on that? So do you sort of have do you get an alert when something has become available, because you can sort of subscribe to the National Archives, or do you just sort of keep checking back in every so often?
Yeah, so I check depending on what I'm writing. So when I went to do the women's book, looking at the women, I knew there were women, at least a third of the network in Belgium, behind the lines in World War One, and then I wondered about the World War Two, the clearance service. So you look at what's been published, which is very, very little on the clearance service of World War Two. But then I asked some of my contacts in Belgium, and it became clear actually a decade ago. So if I start with the Imperial War Museum, there were 2 red boxes in the Imperial War Museum marked La Dame Blanche, the White Lady. That's World War One, and they're all in French. So my French kind of isn't good enough, but I have now sort of brushed up, and a little bit of Google Translate does help you in the last year or so to sort of just check what you're doing. So there was that, but the clearance service, when I inquired at the Imperial War Museum a decade ago, there was nothing. But when I went to look for the women's book, there are now 8 boxes, these red boxes for clearance service of World War II. So someone's obviously decided it's okay for them to be available, but they weren't catalogued. I had to just ask what there was, so you couldn't search it. And then I also asked my contacts in Belgium, and they said to me, well, actually, we're in the process of declassifying the agent files for the clearance service and others. And what do you want to see? And we'll release them to you slightly early. And once they're released to you, then we'll just put them straight into the archives. It's going to take them 5 years to declassify everything. But I was able to look at it just a little bit earlier. And I'm not the only historian, I'm sure. But they did check that I wasn't going to misuse it or denigrate any of their history. They checked me out, apparently, to check that I am a responsible historian. I didn't know that until a bit further down the line. But that's essentially it. That material has become available, and it wasn't available a decade ago. So the stuff's coming out all the time.
Brilliant. And Alan, I noticed in your Wikipedia entry that not only are you a very celebrated novelist and biographer, but that you're also a security analyst. And I was intrigued by that and wondered if you could shed more light on that.
That's a bit out of date. In the wake of 9/11, I was asked to go and do a security job in the Joint Terrorism Analysis Center, known as JTAC. And that was analyzing terrorist threats, basically. So that's when that dates from. But I left that in 2010, something like that. So yeah, yes, I don't know who did the Wikipedia entry, but they were right at the time, perhaps, but not now.
Okay. No, well, it's. I mean, you made the point that actually, as a writer, you often have to do other things, and clearly there's overlap, in your research, your work, and that whole field of espionage. You mentioned at the very beginning of the talk that your first novel came to you as a result of having been a soldier in the Troubles.
Mm.
Is it that your experience led you to want to write about it, or had you always been wanted to be a writer from childhood?
No, I'm afraid I think it came on with early adolescence, really. I wanted to be a great poet, and I had a friend who wanted to be a great artist, and he left school early and had a job so he could afford cigarettes. So we'd smoke gouloirs, drink black coffee in coffee bars together, and we thought this is how it happened. Somehow you became a great poet and a great artist, and gradually it took some years for the realization that one needed to do something else to sink in. And then I was going to be a great playwright for a while, and then I was going to be a great novelist. And so I went on writing these awful unpublishable scripts through most of my 20s.
But you got there in the end.
Yeah, yes.
Congratulations. Perseverance, I think, is key. Oh, I can see Jenny has come back on.
Yeah, Shona, we've had a really interesting question. And in fact, because I'm a big fan of Alan's latest novel, one of our listeners has asked if you have any intention on writing a sequel.
Oh, that's very nice of whoever this listener is. What a wonderful question. Yes, the latest one is called Number 2 Whitehall Court, and I've already written a sequel, which has a working title, Number 1 St. James's Park, but I'm not sure that's going to be the actual title. But the book is with the publisher at the moment, and I hope it'll come out next year, probably with the paperback of Number 2 Whitehall Court, I hope.
Oh, exciting.
Yes. And it's still featuring Emily Gray and one or two of the other characters that appear in the first book.
The same listener has written a really interesting point saying, on the subject of visiting places of interest, anyone who goes to the National Archives could consider walking down West Hall Road, which is nearby. Have either of you done that? No?
No.
It said, in the 1920s, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Ernst Vetterlein, who had arguably been Imperial Russia's best codebreaker, I bet you both know him, came to Britain after the 1917 revolutions and spent almost all the rest of his life working for Room 40, and then the government code and cipher school, lived in a large house on that road.
I didn't know they were there. I knew about Room 40, as I'm sure Helen, but
yeah, the Naval Intelligence lot, isn't it? Yeah.
Knew vaguely about Fetterline, but I certainly didn't know about that house and that's where they were. And I wonder for how long. Because they moved later, certainly.
So if you go to the National Archives, I don't even know where are the National Archives? We people like me who have no idea where they are. And can you get in easily, or how does it work?
Sorry?
How does one go to the National Archives? Where are they?
You go to Kew.
Okay.
And that's where they are.
Oh.
And you can look up their address and just go along.
Can you just go, like, turn up tomorrow and go along to the National Archives? Or do you have to book in? How does it work?
Well, yeah, you sign in and you tell them what you're looking for. It might be something that's readily available, or you might have to book it in advance. But they're very helpful.
Depends if it's kept off site, but you also need to have a reader's card, which is free, and you just have to take two forms of ID, two different forms of ID. But you can also use the library part or access family material like Ancestry, etc., for free outside the reading rooms, which are just next door. It was in the same building. But the other thing, though, I just saw something today. They've extended their MI5 exhibition. So on the ground floor near the cafe, there's the most phenomenal MI5 exhibition. And they've had queues going out the door nearly every day. Mondays they're closed, so just double check. And they're open later on some evenings. It's a free exhibition, and it's got real artifacts, and it's absolutely captivated the public imagination. And the demand has been so great, they've been allowed to extend it for just a few more weeks. You don't have to book, you just turn up, but you might have to queue. But it's well worth seeing. It's fabulous.
That's a top tip. So our very educated listener has said Fetterlein lived in that house in West Hall Road in 1923, which is the year he was naturalised. The naturalisation file seems to be the only one that's solely about him. And he knows Toby knows about the MI5 exhibition is running until the 23rd of November. So I'm definitely going to get myself down there. That was a top tip. Very quick, we have 2 minutes left. Shona, did we have any other questions that you didn't pick up yet?
Not that I can see. If anyone who's on the chat has a question, then please let us know. We can unmute you and you could actually ask it yourself if you'd like to. Silence.
And we only have 2 minutes left, so that will lead me to say,
I will dive in with a quick comment, although I'll see what Alan thinks of it. He was talking about guns, and it reminded me that perhaps the most famous of spy authors, Ian Fleming, famously got James Bond's gun wrong, and a Major Bothroyd wrote to him and told him, but he was so pleased that this was how the Beretta or whatever I think became the final gun for James Bond, or the whichever one it was. And wrote him in as a character in his future books, even made it into the films. So you're in good company getting guns wrong, Alan, I think.
Yes. In fact, the one query I had about a gun, I actually turned out to be right on, but it took a lot of proving that I was right. But it just made me very cautious. And in the latest novel, Emily Gray has a gun at one point, but I think I'm pretty careful about what I say about it.
I think anything technical can obviously catch you up. It's a lesson for budding authors everywhere. Yes.
Yeah.
Back
But
to you, Jenny.
amongst thrillers in recent decades, there's a great vogue for technicalities. So as though it adds reality, I think. So if you can say the muzzle velocity of something and the impact at 100 yards and all that sort of thing, people seem to like it. So some writers, like Lee Child, have done a lot of research on that.
I found if you ask somebody on Twitter X, I'm very active on that on social media, if you've got a really technical question and you ask it, throw it out there, I've had a reply within 5 minutes from 3 or 4 people who are experts on whatever it is. It might be a German uniform, it might be on insignia, guns. So that's really useful. That's where we're at in terms of the modern age.
Another top tip. Love it.
Yes.
Right, we are at the top of the hour and we like to start and finish on time. A huge thank you, Helen and Alan. That has been super interesting. I've loved asking you the questions. Thank you, Shona, for jumping in with the questions from the audience, and particularly to Toby, our listener, who was very well informed. So, Alan, look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks in Cuckfield. Everybody else, if you haven't booked your tickets, please get online. Carol put the link in the chat. We've got some really, really interesting talks this year. So I hope to see you all in Cuckfield in a couple of weeks. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.